I must thank my viewers and my subscribers as for supporting me, and you have also mailed me to talk about many more such things. Well, I will be talking about many more things, but yes, we have been talking about Dipesh Chakrabarty. We have also discussed Bruno Latour. I will be coming with the more videos on Bruno Latour and what is his take and how he is different from Dipesh Chakrabarty when it is come to the modernity. And Bruno Latour has a very interesting take on cosmopolitanity. So from cosmopolitanity to cosmopolitics to cosmogeny, I will discuss step by step how Bruno Latour is looking at things. But now, when we look at the history of subaltern studies and the way Dipesh Chakrabarty has a take on it, and moving away from this subaltern thing and then to planetarity, the age of planets or climate, planetary history, all of these things, we are in between a series. Now we are looking at another very beautiful take as he moves into the chapter 3, Modernity and the Past, a critical tribute to Ashis Nandy. And I'm reading the most crucial parts. Whatever else it may mean for those who do not explicitly set out to intellectualize, a self conscious embracing of modernity has since the middle of the 19th century posed a question to the Indian intellectual. What does one do with or about those practices of the past that seem undesirable but that apparently refuse to die? Consider the undemocratic and cruel practice of caste discrimination or the practice of sati, self immolation by widows, among upper class Hindus in India. It is far from certain that these practices are extinct even in educated milieus. Sati, of course, being far less common than caste discrimination. Or try and imagine the numerous instances of everyday incidents where people in the subcontinent invoke the supernatural, whether in newspaper columns, on astrology, or in the cause of a political movement. All academic intellectuals in India, like intellectuals in many other third world countries, would have grown up with such practices. These experiences may form the innocent stuff of childhood memories, but they may also be not so innocent after all. Tradition takes a murderous form when the supernatural event of images of the god Ganesh drinking milk gets a political interpretation justifying a militantly Hindu and anti Muslim political movement, or when astrology or indigenous medicine acts as an excuse for sheer commercial exploitation of the needy or the poor. This experience of being a modern intellectual in an India in which undesirable practices from the past seem to help produce deformities in the modern gives that modernity a peculiar edge. The intellectual has an ambient relation to the past, whether this past is embodied in rural India or in one's older relatives. This can be seen in the problem of defining tradition. Should tradition include all the past, or should it include only those bits of the past that meet with our approval today? Should the aim of education be to educate people out of the practices that are contrary to the principles of modernity, to move them away from activities or ideas that scientific rationality, democratic politics, and modern aesthetics find disturbing, if not downright repulsive? Only rarely have Indian intellectuals addressed this problem in a self conscious manner, although it often erupts in what they write about the past. In the brief span of this short essay on Ashis Nandy, who more than anybody else in India have drawn our attention to the questions that the very idea of tradition poses to all modernizers slash cultural critiques of the subcontinent, I will endeavor to show how the question with which I began, the problem of the undesirable past, configures itself in Nondi's work. Much of Nondi's admirable and powerful critique of modernity strikes me as somewhat uh, decisionist in spirit. By decisionist, I mean a disposition that allows the critic to talk about the future and the past as though there were concrete, value laden choices or decisions to be made with regard to both. The critic is guided by his or her values as to what the most desirable, sane, and wise future for humanity should be, and looks to the past as a warehouse of resources on which to draw as needed. This position is connected to but attributedly different from the revolutionary modernist position, that of early Ambedkar, for instance, in his polemic against Gandhi about the demerits of caste, in which the reformer seeks to bring a particular history to nullity in order to build society up from scratch. Many modernizers have talked about scrapping the past altogether. Nondi's position, by contrast, is respectful of the past without being bound by it. It uses tradition but in a way that is guided by the critique of the present that it has developed. In discussing Gandhi, in many ways, the person who comes closest to his idea of a wise political leader, Nandi names his position critical traditionalism. Critical traditionalism, according to Nandi, is different from uncritical adulation of past practices, a position that he finds illustrated in the writings of the Anglo Sri Lankan intellectual Annadakanist Kumaraswamy. For Kumaraswamy, says Nandi, and I quote, tradition remains homogeneous and undifferentiated from the point of view of man made suffering. His defense of the charming theory of sati, for example, never takes into account its victims, the women who often died without the benefit of the theory. Such traditionalism reactively demystifies modernity to remystify traditions. Likewise, one may concur with Kumarswamy that the untouchables in traditional India were better off than the proletariat in the industrial societies. But this would be an empty statement to those victimized by the caste system today, when many untouchables opt for proletarization in contemporary India. Is their choice merely a function of false self knowledge? I am afraid Kumaraswamy's traditionalism, despite being holistic by design, does not allow a creative, critical use of modernity within traditions. And I unquote. See, extremely important point that Nondi's positive examples are those of Gandhi and Tagore, arguably the two best products of Indo British cultural encounter. Nondi sees Tagore's novel Gora as pointing to another kind of tradition which is reflective as well as self critical, which does not reject or bypass the experience of modernity but encapsulates or digests it. Gandhi he names as someone who represented this concept of critical traditionalism aggressively. Cleanly, then scholars who have accused Nondi of practicing some kind of atavistic indigenism have read him incorrectly. His position is indeed different from that of the revolutionary modernizer, but it is also different from that of a so called nativist. Critical traditionalists are critical of post Enlightenment rationalism as an overall guide to living, although they do not reject science in toto. The critical traditionalism I quote I am talking about does not have to see modern science as alien to it, even though it may see it as alienating. Such traditionalism uncompromisingly criticizes isolation and the over concern with objectivity, but it never denies the creative possibilities of limited objectivity. Ultimately, intelligence and knowledge are poor, in fact, dangerous substitutes for intellect and wisdom. And I unquote. This limited appreciation of objectivity leads to a theory of resisting enslavement to the discipline of history. I quote, liberation from the fear of childhood, writes Nondi, in critiquing a modern conception of life stereotypes humans is also liberation from the more subtly institutionalized ethnocentrism towards pastimes. By ethnocentrism, he means the process whereby, in the name of objectivity, the historian mobilizes voices from the past for fighting projects that are modern and contemporary. What makes the enterprise ethnocentric for Nondi is the fact that, unlike the native informants of the anthropologist, these voices cannot talk back or argue with the historian. Elsewhere, I have discussed the absolute and total subjection of the subjects of history, who can neither rebel against the present times nor contest the present interpretations of the past. The point receives elaboration in an essay on Gandhi. Critics of objectification have not often noticed that the subjects of scientific history are subjects irrevocably and permanently. There can be no transference, no real dialogue, perceived mutuality or continuity between the historian and his subjects from the subject's point of view. The historian's subjects are, after all, mostly dead. One wonders if some vague awareness of this asymmetry between the subjects and the objects and between the knowers and the known prompted Gandhi to reject history as a guide to moral action and derive such guidance from his reading of texts and myths. Gandhi, like Blake and Thoreau before him, defied this new fatalism, the idea of the historical laws of our times. Myth for history, tradition for modernity, wisdom and intellect for science and intelligence. None these choices are clear, but they are, in my sense, decisionist. They do not share the same ground with those of the Marxist or liberal revolutionary, for they are neither about a completely willful rejection of the past nor about viewing history as a process of dialectical overcoming of the past. Nondi's choices may even sound conservative in the good sense of the term, but one would be mistaken to see Nondi as anything but a modern intellectual. For decisionism, even of his kind, entails the same kind of heroic self invention that has characterized the modern in Europe. The theme of choice, albeit backed up by the notion of wisdom rather than that of scientific objectivity, and in particular the continual construction in his writings of an object called the future, an object without which Nondi's critique of Western modernity would have no meaning, tells us that we are listening to an intellectual who takes his bearings in the world from corners that are unmistakably modern. I want to suggest that what makes Nondi's critique of modernity truly interesting and powerful is a particular tension that sometimes breaks the surface in his writings. Yes, it is a tension between the decisionist, heroic strand and certain other possible positions with regard to the past that do share the voluntarism of the critical traditionalist. These other positions are not subject to the mutually exclusive binary of historical law, modern fatalism versus mythopoetic fables. Nor do they offer us immediate choices about how to live, mainly because these are positions that do not assume complete transparency of the object of investigation, whatever that object may be, society, culture, tradition. In these positions, one gives up the assumption that more research or intelligence will help us dispel the opacity in the object itself. Even the warmth of respect that the critical traditionalist displays toward the past does not dissolve the mist of perception here any more than does the light of scientific reason. It is at this point that Nondi's sensibilities cease to suggest solutions such as critical traditionalism and become instead an invitation to deepen our questions. I say this in a spirit of gratitude, for it is unfortunately a rare moment in current Indian scholarship when, instead of rushing to suggest that solutions are just around the corner if only we would listen to the right minded analyst or analysis, an intellectual actually allows the question to gather depth. And I repeat, this is a very important line and you can note it down, that an intellectual actually allows the question to gather depth. I see such a moment emerging in a controversial essay that Nondi wrote in the course of the debate on sati that ensued in India after Roop Kanwar, a young woman from the village of Diolara near Jaipur in Rajasthan, killed herself by becoming a sati in 1987. The question of her agency is naturally hotly debated, albeit irresolvably. Nandi's was an angry essay. The debates between Nandi and his supporters on the one hand and some secular liberals and feminist intellectuals on the other were heated exchanges in which each side sought to classify and abuse the other. Thus, Nandi called his opponents Anglophile, psychologically uprooted Indians, and they retaliated by writing about attempts, usually from anti Marxist, neo Gandhian positions, to re establish the difference between us and them, the West, by taking a stand against the values of enlightenment, reason, science, progress, using a rhetoric of anti colonial indigenism. Nandi himself mentions with justifiable relish some of the criticism that his essay received on publication. It was read as directly supporting Sati, and some, not knowing that I was not a Hindu, even found in it indicators of Hindu fanaticism. The labels traded were and are unhelpful. We have to argue against Nandi, for example, that no Indian, however much an Anglophile, is thereby rendered an instance of a culturally uprooted person. Anglophilia has existed in India as a phenomenon of contemporary Indian culture. It is culturally as legitimate as any form of orthopraxy. Being westernized is one way of being Indian. Similarly, it is patently absurd to suggest that Nandi could have been in any way abating the practice of sati. Even the few quotes from his writings that I have used here make clear how unfair that charge is. For me, the interesting moment in Nondi's reflections on sati comes when he recognizes an element of duality in the attitude that intellectuals like Rabindranath Tagore, Abanindranath Thakur, and Ananda Kumar Swami displayed toward the phenomenon of sati. They, Nandi found, were appreciative of the values for which the practice was meant to stand in quasi mythic, idealized representations of the past, while, as in the case of the Tagore family, they fought against the real practice in their own times. This innovative distinction between the mythic sati and the historical sati is grist to Nandi's mill of critical traditionalism. It underwrites his injunction that once modernity has arrived and has inserted everybody in historical time, one should approach the myths of the past respectfully and use them to fight historical battles for a more just society. He writes, and I quote, this differentiation between sati in mythical time and sati in historical time, between sati as an event, ghatana, and sati as a system, pratha. So, between ghatana and pratha, between the authentic sati and its inauthentic offspring, between those who respect it and those who organize it in our times, is not my contribution to the understanding of the right. These distinctions were already implicit. For instance, in the writings of Rabindranath Tagore, who was an aggressive opponent of sati as practiced in contemporary times, yet respectful towards the ideas behind it. At first sight, this may look like a vindication of Nandi's strategy of critical traditionalism. Yet the essay is interesting because the strategy actually breaks down in other places. How can one completely separate a positive interpretation of sati from a critical rejection of the action of becoming sati? Why would such an interpretation not be an indirect and unintended way of legitimizing the act itself? How would one completely separate myth from history? Why is a tradition entitled to respect even when one does not agree with it? Its popularity is no clear answer. Any strategist politician in a political system where numbers matter must reckon with that which is genuinely popular. But this does not mean that the popular practice is respectable. One can perform effectively by instrumentally the language of respect in order to mobilize the masses. Nandi is not an advocate of the cynical or instrumental use of respect, nor do I read him as recommending the language of politeness that many, not all anthropologists use, which in effect says to the native, yes, I respect your beliefs, but they are not mine. This kind of respect is as shallow as the instrumental kind, and as we know, is often replaced by arrogance when the proverbial push comes to shove. Some of Nandi's answers to the question why the tradition, as distinct from the practice of sati, is to be respected are couched in terms of the desire not to be alienated. He asks, what does one do with the faith of millions of Indians that the soil that received the divided body of sati constitutes the sacred land of India? Once again, there seems to be no reason why a minority position, which is the only place from which reformers can begin, must be described as alienated. One can emphasize and still genuinely disagree. If the answer is in terms of a humanist plea for respect for different life worlds, then it is not clear how that answer would suit the strategy of critical traditionalism, for it must be remembered that the aim of this strategy is eventually to build a more just society, as Nandi explains repeatedly in his Traditions, Tyranny, and Utopias. So we must take into account Ashis Nandi's perspective in his Traditions, Tyranny, and Utopia. What is he talking about? He is talking about building a more just society. There is no guarantee that the life world that one respects will truly bend itself to such a project. So Nandi recognizes a problem here, but the recognition is not yet explicit. His critique of the violence of the extreme modernizers is persuasive. Yet the grounds for the respectful attitude that he recommends toward tradition are not clear when we are confronted with a cultural monstrosity such as sati. Because he does not yet explicitly confront the issue that the past has produced at this point for his problematic how to combine a respectful attitude toward tradition with the search for the principles with which to build a more just society, the dilemma breaks out into a plethora of practical policy related questions. Commenting on the ambiguities and impracticalities contained in a bill recently passed in the Indian Parliament, with assistance from feminists banning any kind of glorification of sati, Nandi launches into a series of powerful but rhetorical questions. And I quote, how far, Nandi writes, can or should glorification of sati go? Does the new law mean that children will not read about or admire Queen Padmini's self chosen death in medieval times? Does it mean that that part of the Mahabharata which describes Madri's sati will now be censured? What about Rabindranath Tagore's awe inspiring, respectful depiction of sati and Abanindranath Thakur's brilliant invocation of the courage, idealism, and tragedy of sati in medieval Rajasthan? Do we proscribe their works too? What about Kabir, who constantly uses the impulse to sati as an image of surrendering one's ego to God? Does one ban the celebration of Durga Puja, or for that matter Kalidasa's Kumar Sambhava? Since both celebrate the goddess who committed sati, do we follow the logic of the two young activists who were keen to get the Ramayana declared unconstitutional? That these questions may not in the future remain merely theoretical or hypothetical is made obvious by the fact that the Indian History Congress felt obliged to adopt a statement critical of the TV Ramayana in its 1988 convention. Behind these questions lies a larger issue. How does a modern intellectual think about the way a culture may have elaborated a series of values for itself from practices of cruelty and violence? Sati is one example, blood feud could be another. Here I am deliberately avoiding Nandi's more practical formulation of the question. What does one do? And asking instead, how does one think? Does doers will have to answer their questions practically in terms of the specific historical opportunities available to them, and that is why the options of a Tagore or a Kumar Swami may be available to us, although this is no reason for not considering their examples carefully. Besides, my location in the United States makes it pretentious for me to consider the practical question. But as an academic intellectual from India, I can join Nandi and his colleagues in the shared project of thinking about India. In answering this question, I take my cue from a perspective remark of Nandi's Every Culture. He says has a dark side. Sati in the Kali Yuga is an actualization of some of the possibilities inherent in the darker side of India's traditional culture. Even if this actualization has been side of India's traditional culture, even if this actualization has been made possible by the forces of modernity, impinging on and seeking to subvert the culture. After all, the tradition of sati exists only in some cultures, not in all. The kind of pathological self expression displayed by some cultures in South Asia is not found in other parts of the world. Nandi's use of the word dark is obviously related to his use of the word pathology. I grant him that use, Although I will note that it is just as normal for human beings to contract a disease as it is for them to seek a cure, to seek a restoration to some kind of a normal, although not necessarily normalized body. One might think of cultures in similar terms, whether modern or not. Cultures will have pathological aspects, just as Nandi argues, and some of our choices may be between pathologies. But I want to read the work dark in its more literal sense. Dark is where light cannot pass. It is that which cannot be illuminated. There are parts of society that remain opaque to the theoretical gaze of the modern analyst. Why a history of cultural practices will seize on a particular practice, especially a practice of cruelty and or violence, and elaborate many of its own themes around it, is a question that cannot be answered by the social sciences. It is also in this literal sense, then, it seems to me that cultural practices have a dark side. We cannot see into them, not everywhere. In saying this, then I oppose the liberal modernist whose investigative methods not only treat the investigator as transparent but also assume that society itself is such a transparent object that they can look into its heart and find an explanatory key in class, patriarchy, technology. My point is that societies do not exist in an object like fashion. We analysts construct them as analyzable objects. What exists out there are translucent at best. Beyond a certain point, theory cannot see. And where theory cannot see is where we live only practically. None of this denies the heuristic value of class, patriarchy, or technology in social analysis. But clarity of a constructed model is not the same as clarity of the object for which the model stands. But this position also obliges me to modify Nandi's strategy of critical traditionalism in one important respect. If it is true that I do not entirely see into the society, then it follows that I cannot use tradition in a completely voluntarist or decisionist manner. To the extent that I am self consciously modern, Nandi's strategy may provide an ethic of living and of working for a more acceptable future. But the past also comes to me in ways that I cannot see or figure out, or can see or figure out only retrospectively. It comes to me as taste, as embodied memories, as cultural training of the senses, as reflexes, often as things that I do not even know that I carry. It has the capacity, in other words, to take me by surprise and to overwhelm and shock me. Faced with this, I cease to be the self inventing hero of modern life. As happens in the relation between humans and language, I am to some extent a tool in the hands of pasts and traditions. They speak through me even before I have chosen them critically or approached them with respect. That is why it seems to me that, in addition to the feeling of respect for traditions, fear and anxiety would have to be the other effects with which the modern intellectual modernity here implying a capacity to create the future as an object of deliberate action relates to the past. One never knows with any degree of certainty that a sati will never happen again or that an ugly communal riot will never again break out. It is out of this anxiety that the desire arises in the breast of the political revolutionary to scrap the past, to start from scratch, to create, as they say, the new man. Out of the same fear may even arise the attitude of respect. But pasts retain, as Derrida says, a power to haunt. They are a play of the visible and the invisible. They partially resist discursivity in the same way the pain resists language. My theory then always somewhat gropes and, as in all cases of speculation, takes a leap in the dark. And where theory cannot see, I can live only practically, the future ceasing to exist as an object of analytic consideration, while it can always be the subject of poetic utterance. Decisions which have this factor of darkness built into them cannot, therefore, be based on any ground of certainty that would justify the infliction of suffering on others in the name of progress. This is the burden of Nandi's critique of modernity, and with it I concur. At the same time, I would argue that an acknowledgement of the opacity of the world makes critical traditionalism less voluntarist than I found it to be on my first few readings of Nandi. A commitment to a future that we want to work out in advance makes us anxious, at least in principle, about my past in ways that are peculiar to the modern. As moderns, we may therefore want to defy the past and reduce it to nothing. That, as I have said, is the path of the revolutionary, and it is open to much of Nandi's critique. Alternatively, we may want to respect the past and relate critically, as Nandi so superbly explains to tradition. The problem with the choice, it seems to me, is that it overstates the autonomy that we have with respect to the past. To live with a limited sense of autonomy is to accept pragmatism as a principle of living. I end here. Thank you for joining with us with this fascinating debate on Ashish Nandi.